President Macron's in tray isn't just filled with pandemic response, though it certainly has a lot of that. There are curfews, proper curfews, not the pubs closing at 10, but actually off the streets, don't be out after 10 o'clock in 9 major French cities this week. But even so, in a recent speech, the president found time to draw up new battle lines in the fight against Islamic extremism in France. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a feminist activist, former Dutch politician, and she's written in this week's Spectator commending President Macron's speech that says he should go further. She joins me now. Ayaan, thank you for being with us. What is it that you liked about what President Macron had said?
Well, I loved it that he defined the problem as clearly as possible, because I think the failure of many Western leaders, at least as far back as 9/11/2001, was they're euphemizing and obfuscating the problem and calling it anything but its real name. So I think it takes a great deal of courage for a leader on that level to come out and say, what we are facing is Islamist separatism. And so I think that's a first step. But then what follows out of that, I'm a little skeptical, because I've had Angela Merkel declare that multiculturalism was dead. I've at one point even had David Cameron say he was going to take on these groups. And here in the United States of America, I've had President Trump say he was going to go after the ideological, not just jihad, the violent Islamists, but those who dedicate their time to poisoning and spreading these ideas. And we'll see. Well, we'll see what he does with it.
But what is meant by this word separatism? Can you just explain that? I mean, to my knowledge, French Muslims are not calling for a separate French Muslim state.
So the thing is, if you understand political Islam as a separate philosophy, and it is a philosophy that is confronting liberal societies and saying the liberal philosophies that Western societies are based on are corrupt, they're wrong, they have to be replaced with something else. What then these Islamists have done is they have taken advantage of the immigrant populations and convinced them, in the case of France, for instance, that they are in a nation state within a nation state. And so it's very clear, and I think it's the right thing for him to do, to confront these Islamists.
But what's the evidence that the vast majority or even a substantial minority of French Muslims are Islamists?
Well, there's a great deal of evidence for that's been building up, and it's not just in France, it's in the UK, it's in other European countries, and it's here in America. The fact that there are Islamists, there's been plenty of evidence for that. You've had here in the UK, you've had.
But what about as a majority or even a substantial minority? There are, of course, you're quite right, there are Islamists in France. But what's the evidence that they represent even a substantial minority of the French Muslim community?
Substantial enough to plot terrorist attacks, substantial enough to refuse to learn the French language and live by French norms and French standards. There's a substantial evidence to show us that there is what I would say the white French would regard as an underclass of people who just refuse to be or are incapable of being assimilated into the wider French economy and society. And what, the question then is, why is that happening? And I think that not just the French, in this, we're using France as an example, but I think that immigration out of Muslim countries into Western society has, yes, brought a somewhat culture clash, but leaders have failed constantly, and they failed in 4 ways. They failed to make it very clear what Islamism is. They've allied with the wrong people. They have failed to regulate immigration, and there's been a failure by leadership to use the foreign tools or foreign policy tools to stop foreign countries from basically usurping the minorities, and look at a country like Turkey and what it's doing in France, what it's doing in Germany. There's been a failure to use foreign policy tools to stop these countries from financing Islamist ideology on European soil.
I know, Ayaan, we have to let you go shortly. Just two other quick questions. I mean, undoubtedly, there is an Islamic underclass in France. You see that in some of the suburbs of the biggest cities. They feel excluded. They are almost separate in some ways. But almost every Western country has an underclass like that. And it's not always Islamic. In Britain, you could see a white underclass has developed in cities, the city of Glasgow, your husband's city, for example. In many other parts of the West, you see a black underclass developed over many years, feeling excluded. I mean, given that most French immigrants are Muslim, that's what makes French immigration different from British or American or even German immigration. They're mainly Muslim. Was it not inevitable, and it may have nothing to do with Islam, that there is an Islamic underclass in France?
Yes, indeed. And I think one of the failures I mentioned is this failure to regulate immigration, give the Muslim communities that are already in France an opportunity to go through the process of integration or assimilation, as we call it here in the United States, and use the tools that a state has to make it very clear to those individuals and organizations that are turning people's minds away from what it is to be French and to assimilate, and instead brainwashing them into radical Islam. Those organizations and those individuals are groups that they shouldn't have partnered with, and for a long time they did. And for a long time, France, and it's not just France, but France has pretty much outsourced what they thought was the integration process to other countries. And I think they have to stop that. That is my piece in the
Spectator.
I think there's an awakening now. And I hope that Macron really means it, and that he isn't just saying these things to win the election in 2022, but that he's dedicated to really doing something about this problem and setting an example for the other European leaders.
Well, we shall see how he follows it up after this speech. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, thank you for writing your piece for The Spectator this week and for joining us from the Hoover Institution in California. Thank you very much.